Ottawa has rejected a lot of the amendments from the Senate in regards to Bill C-69, the bill that Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has referred to as the anti-pipeline bill. Only 62 of the more than 180 were accepted outright. Now, joining me now to discuss this is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, it appears as though a lot of the Liberal senator amendments were accepted, but many of the Conservative senator tweaks, well, they were not.
That's right. Yeah. So this has been a long-running thing in federal politics and provincial politics here too. I mean, you might remember from the election campaign that Jason Kenney spoke a lot about this bill, which basically rejigs the approvals process for industry projects, including things like pipelines. And some industry players have worried and said that, well, we might never be able to get a pipeline project built if this goes ahead. So the Senate studied this. It was in the Senate committee. The Senate committee made, as you said, over 180 recommendations on fixing this bill up. Finished up in the Senate, came back to the House of Commons. Now the House of Commons, as you said, accepted 62. Another 35-ish, give or take, amendments were also accepted in sort of a heavily modified form. So this bill now goes back to the Senate, and they're going to go through it again. And it's quite a bit of consternation. A few days ago, Jason Kenney and a handful of other premiers, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and Ontario, I believe, sent a letter to Trudeau saying, in the interests of national unity, man, you've got to back off on this. And so, this is a real showdown right now between the premiers and the prime minister, in addition to being a bit of a showdown between the members of parliament and the senators.
And it's interesting, too. Didn't Trudeau call out the premiers saying, no, you have a problem with national unity. It's your fault.
He did, yeah. So, this is, I think, the first time in my memory since Jason Kenney has been elected that there has been sort of such a back and forth between the prime minister and the premiers on this. And, Kenney doubled down on this and Trudeau said what he said going into, I believe it was the House of Commons yesterday. Nobody's particularly happy about this, but there are promises of lawsuits have been made by the provincial government here. So certainly Jason Kenney and his United Conservatives aren't backing down on this one.
So for journalists like you and I, this is a pretty exciting time, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Now, Tyler, there was a big pro-energy rally in Calgary recently outside of the petroleum show. Many of the protesters were worked up about Bill C-69, which we were just discussing, and C-48. Now, you were on the ground, boots on the ground. Tell me a bit about it.
I was, yeah. So I drove down to check it all out, and there were hundreds, at least, maybe thousands of people outside. The estimates, as is normal with these things, varied pretty considerably. But a whole roster of speakers. Premier Scott Moe is there, Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage, Ontario Energy Minister Greg Rickford, Ellis Ross, politician from British Columbia, and a former Haisla Nation councillor. And they all talked in sort of broad strokes about how they need a strong Alberta economy to themselves have robust economies and things like that. So they spoke about how they feel Bill C-69 should be scrapped, or at least heavily modified Bill C-48. They said, this isn't even salvageable. This is the tanker ban off the coast of British Columbia. And the crowd had their signs out, the Kill Bill C-69. They had, pictures of Uma Thurman from the Quentin Tarantino film Kill Bill out there. So they were in good spirits. It was a relaxed crowd, but there was quite a bit of unity among these politicians. And I don't listen to BC politicians speak every day or Ontario politicians speak every day, but you hear some of the same talking points when you hear folks in Alberta from whatever political party speak at these sorts of things. But there is, a diversity of argument coming from these people on what their concerns were on this stuff. So there is this coalition of premiers of Conservatives across Canada that represent an awful lot of Canadians and an awful lot of our GDP. This is something I think that Mr. Trudeau needs to keep an eye on.
An awful lot of clout, absolutely. Now, Tyler, the rail deal details have come out. Alberta's got to get its oil to market here, and the Kenney government has entered into discussions with private firms about paying for this. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that's right. So this was a $3.7 billion deal that the New Democrats signed, and very much in the waning days of their government. And Kenney claims that they paid above market rates to have Canadian Pacific and the CNR shipping this oil by rail out to the coast. So the plan at the moment is to try and get the rail shippers to move those contracts over to private oil industry. So instead of the government footing a bill for these contracts, the private industry would pay that bill. Now, Kenney says that these are, confidential negotiations with industry, so he hasn't released scads and scads of details. But this was the first hint, I think, that we've got that they're not so much working on the political solution to this, but they are, which is, the back and forth and the condemning of the deal that the Democrats made, but rather they are meeting with executives and meeting with company officials and trying to get a deal hammered out in the private sector. So the final outcome on that remains to be seen, but well underway to undoing, I think, what Rachel Notley's New Democrats did.
A child welfare bill is proposing $10,000 in fines and 6 months in jail should an adult not report when a child is in need of intervention.
Yes, that's right. So you may remember what was called the Serenity's Law, I should say. And that was the young girl who, I believe she was 4 years old, died in care back in 2014 or so. Now, Mike Ellis, who's a UCP member of the legislature, had introduced this bill in the previous session, and it laid out fairly similar, almost identical, actually, ideas here, and then basically to punish people for not notifying the authorities in cases where a child was endangered. Now, that didn't end up going through. The New Democrats sort of resisted a little bit, their argument being that they had concerns from the police and police unions about it. And so it never really, but it didn't become law, I should say. So it is back in the legislature with some small tweaks. The language in the previous bill suggested that an adult could report to the director of child services, for example. And Ellis has said that he thinks that's too complicated and that the police should be the people that could be contacted in this regard. The idea being that, well, I wouldn't even know how to find the phone number, say, for the local director of children's services if you wanted to report these things, whereas everyone knows how to get in contact with the police. So that's back before the legislature. That's part of this flurry of legislating that they are doing at the moment. We'll see where it goes, but that was a big controversy in the waning days of the last Conservative government and through the NDP years was children in care and child abuse. So, this is it's a hot topic once again, and with a majority, it seems likely that the UCP will be able to get this done.
The United Conservatives are considering returning driver testing to the private sector. Why is that?
Well, basically, the switch over in March that brought them all under government control, they're saying that there's these huge backlogs now and there isn't enough testers. So basically they're saying that, well, they moved too quickly and the system wasn't organized well enough, and now people, I guess, are having to wait to get their driver's testing done. So they're exploring, and Rick McIver criticized this, and simply put, they're exploring ways to fix the system and maybe return it to the way it was. So we sort of know what the problems are: not enough staff, backlogs, things like that. What the fix is going to be, we don't quite know. But certainly the possibility is being floated that it will return to the system that it was, really mere months ago.
Supply bills are coming. Now, why don't you explain to our viewers what exactly they are and their importance?
Yeah, so a supply bill basically keeps the government running. So people who read news from south of the border will know that sort of fairly regularly there's this big crisis in Washington when a shutdown is looming and the government can't pay its staff and people aren't going to work and this huge mess happens. So these interim supply bills basically come before the legislature, have some financial numbers in them, the members vote on it, and it basically allows the government to keep up and running for the interim. So as we have not seen a budget yet, and Jason Kenney's government is promising a budget in the fall, there needs to be a way to keep government open and keep the bills getting paid and invoices being submitted and all that fun stuff. So these supply bills will ensure the government is able to keep up and running. And for the very numbers, the fans of numbers, if they really wanted, they could dig through these things to get some insight into what the province's finances look like right now. And numbers aren't my strong suit, but I can tell you that once these things go ahead, it does mean that the government's going to keep up and running for the summer. So can't complain about that, I'd say.
A contentious issue in the last provincial election, of course, a lot of the NDP were saying, well, if you vote for Jason Kenney and the UCP, it's going to be cut to health care, cut to education. Is that still a real concern at the Ledge right now?
Well, it is. Once he took government, what Jason Kenney started saying was, look, when I was in Ottawa, we had a bloated public service and we had to reduce the size of that public service. and it wasn't super pleasant, but we did it, and we did it mostly through attrition, he says. So there has been a little bit of a shift in language, I would say, since the election and into now the governing period. And I think that's very much the reality of taking a new government. You don't really know all these things until you're sitting in the Premier's office. And to his credit, I don't believe he made the promise that Doug Ford did, which was that no one was going to lose their job. But the idea, I think, behind this reduction in size of government is going to be that you'll have attrition, you'll have retirements, things like that, that are going to lower sort of the overhead and maybe save the government a bit of money. So there is the wedge is being sort of pushed in a little bit, shall we say, and maybe preparing people a little bit for some staffing changes, maybe some cuts, certainly some reductions in staff size. The NDP, of course, is going to seize on that as evidence that this is Klein 2.0. Whether or not that's fair really depends on how successful Kenney's plan of getting this done by attrition really is.
And Albertans should probably prepare for that as well. I mean, Kenney talked about that, the fact that the deficit, the spending is out of control, we're getting deeper and deeper in debt, so cuts have to come somewhere, right?
They do, unless there's a whole whack of money sitting around that the government hasn't got their hands on. I mean, something like a provincial sales tax is certainly not something that Kenney's people have been super fond of, but that is the sort of tool that is on the table in these circumstances. And it was floated back in the Prentice days. So I would be shocked if Kenney had the nerve to introduce a new tax right after cutting the carbon tax. But, stranger things have happened in Canadian politics, I would say.
Tyler, take us inside the legislature for just a moment here, and the animosity between Jason Kenney and Rachel Notley. We talked about the desk thumping before. It got a little out of control. Now it's just clapping with the NDP, no more desk thumping. But how about when they're sparring going at it? I mean, they're both seasoned politicians, and they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, the theater is still there, I think. You can never totally eliminate that. They can behave a little bit better, but there's still heckling, there's still booing. There's the talking points where they're hounding on each other. It feels a little bit gentler than it did during the campaign to me, to be honest with you. It feels like this is a return. Like, you expect this sort of thing in the legislature, I would say. You expect the zingers in question period, the heckling. But the campaign was very personally nasty, I would say, justified or not. I don't particularly come down on either side on that one. But, you saw Rachel Notley and her I should say party at that point, I guess, going very, very hard after Jason Kenney personally. And, that hasn't so much been the case now. There is some real angst over Bill 8, sort of the education reforms that the NDP is calling Bill Hate. There are certainly tensions. There is this theater that always goes on. The NDP is still on the attack, of course, but somehow to me it feels a little bit less nasty than it did sort of mere weeks ago. And I think that's, you walk through the front doors of that institution and you can't help but behave a little bit differently than you do on the campaign trail, I think.
How about some of the other provincial leaders like David Kahn with the Liberals, Stephen Mandel with the Alberta Party? Any talk of them stepping down? They didn't win a seat in the last provincial election. Neither of them did. So is there going to be leadership review maybe, and maybe a new leader for both of those parties?
Gosh, that's a good question. They've been very quiet lately, and so I'm not totally sure what they're up to be honest with you. And the other thing about that is the Freedom Conservative Party, which we do know that Derek Fildebrandt stepped down from, and they need a leader. And certainly, you'll recall in the dying days of the last government and the campaign, there was this rumor that Brian Jean was going to come swooping back down from Fort McMurray and helm the Freedom Conservatives. And that obviously never materialized, but, Brian Jean's always just kind of in the wings, and he's got a bit of an axe to grind against Jason Kenney. So he's, to add to the list of names of the who's who of Canadian Alberta politics who we're not sure what they're going to do next, certainly his name is out there as well.
Yeah, and I'm wondering even if the Alberta Freedom Conservative Party can exist without Derek Fildebrandt. It's
well,
can it even exist without?
It very much was the Derek Fildebrandt Party, wasn't it?
Right.
And,
yeah.
But they certainly did not do as well as people expected. So
right.
Hard to say what's next.
That's true. Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks a lot for joining me once again from Edmonton.
Thanks, Hal.